Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now that the technicians have given us the okay, we can go ahead, since, as we all know, the most important people these days are the people who take the photographs and do the recording, because they immortalize any proceedings we have here. My name is John O'Sullivan. I think I'm known to some of you, but not to all. I'm the president, rather, of the Danube Institute here in Hungary. I will just say very few words about what we are and what we do for those people who are here for the first time. But very simply is this: we are a centre in Central Europe for debate and discussion between different political views. We ourselves generally adhere to what I would call conservatism in cultural and social policy, to classical liberalism in economics, and to Atlanticism in foreign policy. But having said that they are the general attitudes which the Danube Institute has, we also recognize, of course, that not everyone shares these, and we ourselves will admit to being wrong on occasion, not very often, of course, and we like, therefore, to make sure that any debates we have are attended by and have speakers from positions which what I would describe as respectable democratic opponents, generally on the left, of these ideas. Because we believe that, above all else, that what is needed in Central Europe is debate and argument and discussion. There is a great deal of partisanship here, as there is at the moment in the United States, but we actually believe that it would be perhaps less partisanship if there were more argument and discussion. Well, that's our, so to speak, prospectus. We also act as a transmission belt for ideas and for people from this part of the world, well, within Central Europe to begin with, and secondly, between Central Europe, Western Europe, and the English-speaking world. Obviously, also other parts of the world when occasion arises, but unfortunately, given our budget, it doesn't arise too often, though we're able to have debates with people from China and Australia. On this occasion, we don't have an Australian present on the platform, but we have someone who worked in Australia at the University of Queensland for many years, and at Singapore before that. So it may be relevant, which may be relevant in light of the topic. Now, the topic is consciousness and artificial intelligence. This has become quite an interesting topic to masses of people. It may sound, when you actually just say consciousness and artificial intelligence, not to the most interesting topic. Or rather, I should not say that. I should say it might seem to be not the most popular topic. But in fact, that isn't true. Ever since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, there has been on the agenda the question of, can machines have souls? And there are large numbers of people who've come to believe that machines not only can have souls, but will have souls that are superior to those possessed by human beings, if human beings possess souls, because, of course, a large, respectable body of scientific thought doubts that. In fact, there are probably in the world today people who don't believe humans have souls, but do believe machines either have them or will have them in the future. If you doubt this, consider what have been two of the most popular cultural events in the cinema and television in recent years. At the moment, Westworld, a television series, is entering its second season. That was stimulated by the success of a film in the 1970s, Westworld, which starred Yul Brynner and was about a holiday resort in which you could have adventures in the Middle Ages or in the Wild West, and shoot people and make love to beautiful girls if they were, well, presumably attractive men, who were in fact robots, who seemed to be human in every effect but weren't. And of course, the end result of this is that the robots ceased to behave like robots, developed some form of internal consciousness and opinions. And we see this thesis developed even more radically and very interestingly in the television series Westworld. And it turns out that when machines develop souls, they have extraordinarily and consciousness and opinions. They have extraordinarily similar views to those of liberal scriptwriters in Hollywood and of the agenda of progressive liberalism in the world today. Now, the second successful moment or cultural event was another film, which came out in the 80s called Blade Runner. That has recently been remade, in my view, not very successfully, but nonetheless remade. What's significant about Blade Runner is that the climatic scene in it, in which a replicant, a robot in effect, who is about to die, about to perish, makes a speech in which he doesn't claim to be a human being, he doesn't claim to have a soul, but he makes the kind of remarks that only conscious human beings with souls, or with what we take to be souls, would express. And at the end of the speech, out of his hands flies a dove, of course the traditional symbol of the Holy Ghost. So this is further developed in the remake of the movie. Again, in my view, not as successfully as the first film. What is significant is that that moment in the cinema, the speech of the replicant, is one of the most downloaded passages of video on YouTube and generally on the internet. It clearly speaks to a powerful sentiment, a growing sentiment in the human race about, in this case, about possibly a mixture of hope and fear about where the development of artificial intelligence might lead us. Now, there are many ways we could address this topic, and I think around the table we have a number of people who can bring their own backgrounds and intellectual experiences to bear on this. But we're fortunate on the platform to have two very able discussants who've addressed this in print and who are developing from different angles. I'm going to introduce David Dusenbury first, as you will see from the note there. He has written two books, The Space of Time, and Platonic Legislations, and at the moment he's writing a third book for a London publisher. In his thesis, he reconstructs the political anthropology of a 4th century philosopher bishop, it looks like Nemesis, but in fact it's Nemesius of Emesa, now in Syria. His present research is dealing with cosmopolitan themes in pagan and Christian late antique philosophy, but he has become interested in the concept of evil. In particular, is there a link between consciousness and evil? And if there is such a link, by the way, the Garden of Eden story suggests there is such a link, and if there is a link between consciousness and evil, will intelligent machines turn out to be perhaps evil instead of reliably, robotically virtuous, as many of the optimists would suggest? So, having just given you a very broad introduction, David, I look forward to what you have to say. I had dinner with you last night, so I have some sense of how enjoyable it's going to be, and I look forward to your remarks, and then we'll ask David to respond briefly to them, and then you can throw open the floor to the debate. David.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the introduction, and my sincere thanks to the Danube Institute for the invitation to Budapest. It's always a pleasure to return to this beautiful city, and for the exemplary hospitality. So I've been invited here to elaborate a bit upon a short essay that I've written quite recently on artificial intelligence, or AI. This essay is part of a series of essays that I've already sketched out and which I hope to make into a book in the coming year or so. Now, throughout this series, my intention is very simple. I use old texts, literary and philosophical texts, to raise what I take to be very basic but weighty questions regarding the newest wave of technologies. Now, as we've just heard, and as I'm sure all of you will have noticed, the newest wave of technologies promise to give us, quote, intelligent machines. Now, bizarrely, in order to clarify this bizarre state of affairs in which lifelike, human-like, intelligent machines seem to be appearing on the horizon, my title, Immanuel Kant and the Garden of Eden, suggests that I'm going to place an 18th century philosopher in a garden which some of you might suspect never existed, and a garden in which we can all agree neither Kant nor intelligent machines ever featured. So what do I intend to give you in terms of the conference theme, artificial intelligence, in the coming minutes? So I've divided my remarks today into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce certain aspects of the new technology, so-called intelligent technology, and indicate for you, in what I hope will be helpful terms, what differentiates the next wave of machine technology from what I call classical machines and early computers. I also think I'm going to suggest, for those of you who are following the discussion, I'm sure you will all know that no one, in fact, can really agree on whether we possess or will ever possess intelligent machines. This is a source of endless controversy, both among philosophers and indeed among AI designers. And I'm going to suggest that this fact is itself interesting. The fact that no one can establish any sort of convincing or persuasive consensus is a suggestive fact. Now, in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to move on to discuss briefly some aspects of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's anthropology, and then crucially, as my title suggests, I'm going to sketch out the argument of Immanuel Kant's 1786 essay, Conjectural Beginning of Human History. Now, it is this essay which gives us a long-neglected but a very, very interesting sketch of Genesis 2 to 6 on a strictly philosophical register. And having sort of raised the question of what intelligence could mean relevant to technology in the first part of my remarks, in the second part of the lecture, our concern is different. Here we are simply taking as given that AI designers are telling us we will have intelligent machines. And rather than question that claim, we're then going to ask, okay, if we're going to have intelligent machines, what could this mean? And we'll use Kant and the book of Genesis to interrogate what we can expect from so-called intelligent machines. First then, what could it mean that we are on the cusp of a revolution in which machines will acquire intelligence? This question is a contentious one. There are numerous possibilities both for construing the question and for resolving it. For our purposes here, though, note one thing which is crucial. At least in the first instance, the most convincing criterion, the most convincing empirical criterion for determining whether a machine possesses intelligence would be that a machine can perform a task which, when performed by a human person, reflects or requires intelligence. So insofar as machines can be called intelligence, this first criterion, this first approach, would suggest that it is because they behave like human subjects. This is going to be crucial in the second part of my remarks. Truthfully, though, this criterion is unsatisfying, is faulty. Even the crudest computing machines, say a mechanical calculator, can perform calculations which, when performed by humans, requires intelligence. Yet no one would suggest that a mechanical calculator is an intelligent device. So a fuller, more satisfying criterion of machine intelligence would suggest that a machine exhibits intelligence when it can not only execute operations which resemble intelligent human operations, such as multiplying or dividing a large sum. Rather, machine intelligence would be signaled by an apparatus or a system which can, like humans, obtain for itself new data and undertake new operations which lead it in a way that is unprompted by its designer to conduct new and different operations. Now, this is a rather complicated and I hope not too difficult a way of saying that a more convincing criterion of machine intelligence is simply this: machines can learn. Now, again, for those of you who are paying any attention to the discourse surrounding AI, machine learning is really a crucial term, which shows up in all of the contemporary debates. And it's simply hard to deny whatever intellectual depth or lack we might want to ascribe to machines. It's hard to deny that we already possess machines which learn. In a broad sense, they exhibit behaviors which pass beyond the strictly scripted behaviors that their designers assign to them. We already have machines which seem to digest, this is a technical term at the moment, which seem to digest data. They metabolize it. They use the data which they encounter not only to give content to further operations of a scripted type, which is what classical computers would do. Rather, they use this data to branch into new and unpredictable patterns of behavior. So note well, machines that learn, this is really crucial to the first part of my remarks. Machines that learn are no longer machines whose outputs or even whose operations can be foreseen with any certainty in advance. Even those who design these adaptive machine systems cannot predict their outputs. Let me render this more concrete. In January of this year, 2 researchers at Stanford University, Yilun Wang and Mikhail Kozinski, published the findings of a machine system that they devised last year in Palo Alto, California. Their findings made global headlines last year and gave rise to a significant amount of outrage and concern. For this is what Wang and Kozinski found, or at least claimed to have found. Their study has its critics. By analyzing a single facial image and by micro-measuring proportions of that facial image, so we're talking about millions of analytic points on the image itself and comparanda in the data set, the machine system they've devised can predict the sexual orientation of a human subject with more than 80% accuracy. Simply, this is nothing that any human being can do or could ever hope to do. What's perhaps more important is that this is also something that neither Wang nor Kozinski themselves tell us they themselves could have predicted. And it gets even deeper. This is something they tell us they cannot now explain. Kozinski says, I do not know how this system has obtained this astonishing result. So, unlike the result of a classical calculation by a calculator, the designers of machine learning systems cannot predict what the results of machine operations will be. And as I've just said, they cannot, after the machine has produced its findings, they cannot tell us the paths which it followed to obtain the findings. So the paths taken by these new machine systems are untraceable. Already, as of this session, the most advanced machine systems we possess are not only unpredictable, but in their operations are untraceable. So at the operational core of so-called machine intelligence, there is a darkness. Certain machine systems, to put it differently, certain machine systems have already become mysterious to us. Their workings are intensely and definitively opaque. This, it seems to me, is a sign either of some species of machine intelligence or of a new inhuman derivative of intelligence, which is, regardless of how you construe it, quite terrifying. We can no longer see into or see through the devices, the very powerful devices that we are creating. The contrast here is fundamental and stark with what I call classical machines. A classical machine is basically transparent to its designers. The machine is composed of parts. To each part belongs a distinct motion or a set of motion or a stabilizing function. And from all of these parts working in concert, the machine achieves some sort of preordained objective, a repeatable operation, or a range of operations. Now, the materials which are used in building a classical machine might remain less than fully understood to those who create them. The natural forces and relations which make the operation of such a machine possible might still elude us in profound ways. And of course, the designer of a classical machine might not foresee the long-term effects of the operation of a machine. What I'm saying is this, that certain mysteries regarding the nature of matter, the nature and the source of natural force, and the future effects of machines, certain mysteries underlie and attend even the construction of classical machines. Nevertheless, a pre-digital machine, let's say, because in a moment I'm going to talk about early computers, a pre-digital machine is transparent to its designer in terms of mechanical form and in terms of mechanical motion, not necessarily in terms of the nature of matter or the nature of force. So what the 18th century Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico said, roughly, we know what we make, this principle still held true in the 18th century. And it is precisely this basic principle, we know what we make, that seems to me to be breaking down right now. I have some remarks on the early computer, which I just said I would give you, and on the sort of transition from classical machines to intelligent machines, which I'm going to have to actually pass over in order to keep to the half-hour limit. So having passed over the remarks on early computers, let me just sort of contrast Wang and Kaczynski's new machine learning system with both the classical machine I've just described to you and with the early computers, which I have not just described for you. But I think hopefully the point will still be clear. So what has changed when we look at Wang and Kaczynski's machine learning system, which obtains unpredictable results by untraceable and novel methods of operation? A classical machine is both transparent to its designers and fully predictable in terms of its mechanical operation. The new wave of machines, such as Wang and Kaczynski's, are neither transparent nor predictable. And where an early computer, perhaps, this is what I passed over, had some slight halo of meaning inherent in it, inasmuch as it held what we already called, with the early computers, memory. This is, of course, an anthropomorphic term, a computer's memory. Nevertheless, this is deepened with Wang and Kaczynski's machine learning system and others like it, in which fundamentally untraceable paths are taken by the machine. So basically, allow me to summarize, having passed over a good bit of material. A machine system that adapts and explores, which is what we're now talking about, is a machine system that is not fully coded or scripted. It is a machine that finds its own pathways, and these pathways are obscure to us. So we now have machines of a kind to which, in a sense, one could say something belongs. The newest wave of machine systems do not only contain or obtain data which we give them, they are themselves learning to take and thereby to make. Machines are already deriving from raw data patterns and conclusions that were unobtainable to us beforehand, and that once obtained baffle and resist our analysis. This does not mean necessarily that we've imbued machines with reason or intelligence, nor does it necessarily mean that we're capable of doing so. But it does mean that a technological threshold, however we choose to describe it, a technological threshold has been crossed. Now, the obscurity of this threshold, the fact that AI designers and philosophers cannot agree on what threshold has been crossed, this is what I find very interesting. descripted machine behavior suggests to me that we are seeking to place in machine bodies a human-like power, or in the Platonic Christian tradition, a divine power, namely intelligence, the vis cogitativa of the scholastics. We are trying to give to machines a power which we do not understand in ourselves. So the inability of philosophers and AI designers to agree on whether machine intelligence is even a possibility, I would say this confusion obtains more with regard to the term intelligence than to the term machine. So the machines on this reading are beginning to resemble us precisely insofar as we have ceased to understand them. So it is our unclarity, one could say, with regard to ourselves that we are beginning to see in these machines whose operations elude us. Now, this brings us to the lecture's second part, over which I will move quite briefly. I realize I think you have all received a copy of the essay on which this is based. So let me just run through very briefly in the next 5 minutes the argument I make there. You can consult it for yourselves, and we can discuss it during the meeting. So the transition between the first and the second part is constituted precisely by this unclarity. That intelligence, we are trying to give to machines a power which we do not understand in ourselves. And this is, in a sense, the first move I make in the essay, where I say that perhaps we are uneasy about the idea of creating human-like machines, precisely because they will be like us. This is a very obvious sort of suggestion, but it's one that I haven't seen made in quite these terms. And then the question becomes, well, if we're uneasy about the idea of machines being like us, what is it about humankind that we would not want to see replicated in machines? And this leads me to ask, well, okay, what sort of entities are we? This leads us to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his statement, which we hear less and less, certainly in Western Europe, with each passing year. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famously optimistic about humankind and the state of nature, nevertheless says simply, humans are evil. This is the considered and the studied verdict of even the most optimistic line of Enlightenment philosophy in the 18th century. Humans are evil. I then suggest, well, okay, if humans are evil, we should perhaps revive the question of why humans are evil. And Rousseau himself says knowledge has something to do with it. The knowledge we have obtained has something to do with the corruption of our naturally benevolent and good nature. And then, as John already mentioned, there is an obvious link between this idea that knowledge somehow might have corrupted us and the Ur legend of the fall in Europe, namely the legend that we find in Genesis 2 and 3, the Garden of Eden. So then, as I said in my opening remarks, Kant has a really extraordinary, very, very succinct, very interesting article on precisely the Garden of Eden, in which he uses the text in Genesis to challenge Rousseau's idea that humankind is naturally good. Kant believes that we actually are innately prone to evil, but like Rousseau and like the text of Genesis, Kant believes that there is a link between our capacity for reason and our capacity for evil. And I then, more or less directly, on the basis of Kant reading of Genesis, I more or less directly suggest that if, as we are being told, if we are going to create intelligent machines, if we are going to succeed in imbuing machines with a power which we do not fully comprehend in ourselves, then we should by all means be prepared a priori, on the basis of the philosophical tradition, and indeed, to some extent, on the basis of the legend we find in the first pages of Genesis. We should be prepared for the idea, or even the certainty, that the awakening of intelligence and reason will also awaken a certain rebellion against prohibitions and inhibitions which are placed on these machine systems. And then I provide, I don't think in the essay you have before you there's no reference, but I refer to some recent reports, Google Mind. It's a very, very interesting report that was published, I think, late last year. Google Mind, which is probably the single most powerful machine learning system currently in existence, has begun to show highly aggressive patterns of behavior in certain contexts, which astonishes the designers and creators at Google on the basis of Kant, on the basis of the unforgettable narrative of the Garden of Eden. I humbly submit that this should come as no surprise whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. David, that was fascinating. Oh, sorry. David, that was fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to ask David Martin-Jones just to respond briefly to what David has said, and then I'm going to throw open the discussion to the floor. And incidentally, to you, David, it may well be that at some point in answering questions you will want to say some of the things you felt you had to leave out for reasons of space. But first of all, David Martin-Jones, I'll introduce you now, David. You're a visiting professor at the War Studies Department of King's College at the University of London. You've spent some time in Queensland. You have been at the University of Queensland, the University of Tasmania, the University of Malaysia, and several other places. And Singapore. I thought I'd mentioned that, sorry. And your books include The Political Impossibility of Modern Counterinsurgency, and a book on the rise of China. And you are a frequent contributor to periodicals. The ones mentioned here are The Spectator, The Sunday Times, London, The Australian, and I would add Quadrant in Australia, which I used to edit.
It should have been done, though.
And the Hungarian Review, which you've written for now, I think, on more than one occasion. So let me therefore invite you to respond briefly to David, and we'll go on.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me on such a beautiful day to such a beautiful place. I thought that was brilliant, David. I was very interested in some of the areas that you're dealing with, because they interest me too. My initial work was, before I went to Asia, was on conscience and allegiance. So we've got a sort of interest in a similar set of philosophical questions, I think. The area that struck me as being very interesting, just from a book that I've been reading recently, talks of a Google brain as well as a Google mind, and that the whole kind of practice of Google brain thinking is Google has spearheaded the revival of a concept first explored in the 60s, one that had failed until recently: neural networks, which involve computing modeled on the workings of the human brain. Algorithms replicate the brain's information processing and its methods for learning. Google hired the British-born professor Geoff Hinton, who has made the greatest progress in this direction. It also acquired a London-based company called DeepMind, which creates neural networks that taught themselves without human instruction to play video games. Because DeepMind feared the danger of a single company processing such powerful algorithms, it insisted that Google never permit its work to be militarized or sold to intelligence services. And yet, we read in yesterday's Financial Times, for instance, that the future war is going to be between who controls the algorithms. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, my first remark, I've also been paying a bit of attention to this question of the future of war and whether machine entities could be responsible for, escalation and even activation of hostilities in ways that, let's say, human subjects and diplomats find objectionable. But I guess the first comment I would make based on my remarks here is that, in a sense, I'm trying to argue that it is of the nature of algorithms that no one controls them. So we deploy them, but what I was trying to argue, which is based on my best understanding to date of the kind of quasi-mechanics, is that in the actual operation of the algorithm, no one is in control. The machine is undertaking on its own, in a sense one could say, authority.
Yes.
Novel forms of behavior.
Yeah. Well, I think, the further point, because I've got a similar quote to the one you had from your two people about, the creators of these codes not knowing what they're coming up with, and so how the computing model is thinking is beyond whatever they'd programmed into it. So if you look at, the interesting figure is, I think, probably Elon Musk, who anticipates future robot wars. That's why he's desperate to get to Mars, so that we can have a colony there that's not run by robots. I wondered what you thought of that.
Well, I would think, the latter point first, Elon Musk, I would think that if one were to settle on any environment in the known cosmos which would require a complete reliance on robots, it would be Mars. So it seems like a very odd place to go to get away from the complete dependence upon non-human
Maybe you didn't
systems.
think it through.
But no, I would just echo what you were saying. I mean, the researchers I referred to, Kaczynski and Wang, I saw a really extraordinary lecture by Kaczynski where he kept stressing the operations of the system, these are his words, are beyond human comprehension. This is the man who wrote the algorithm that,
Okay.
So one further.
Go ahead.
Because
I was just going to add, by the way, according to the Financial Times, I think yesterday, Elon Musk might conceivably go bust in the next year. So we might revise some of our judgments. But sorry, David.
Well, just one other part. There was I've initially got interested in this area when I was in Korea a year ago, where they're building smart cities based on this kind of algorithmic technology. So the other area is, we are concerned with the, I suppose, liberal democratic implications of all this, but China's not, and nor is Asia more generally. And I wondered what you, because the other area is that China's hugely invested, and so is Japan, and there are already sex robots that are available on the market, and a colleague from Italy that I knew was working on, some of the way that algorithms were made available through dating sites, Ashley Madison being the famous one, where, you could have an affair. But in fact, they found that actually 70% of the people enlisting in Ashley Madison were male, and only 30% women. So they had to get bots to talk to the men, sort of over, so you would think, hi, I'm Christina. It was actually a robot. But then they found the bots started talking to each other because they got bored. So there's a film that he's made about the bots, exchanging dating tips with each other.
Yes, I think it's called Her, and the voice of the robot is, I've forgotten her name, sorry, but Yes, it's a very interesting and sort of upsetting movie. Now, I'm going to throw open the discussion to questions from the floor and contributions from the floor as well. Can I take the first one? Yes, I should have said that, sorry. Any questions from the floor? I see a lot of worried people sitting around the table.
All right, shall we try this? Janet Karakash.
Yes.
I'm wondering how much all of this goes back to the notion of progress, which has taken hold and seems to be absolutely ineradicable at this point. So that all this evolution of robots and so on, artificial intelligence, by definition, it's progress and therefore it's good. And I'm wondering how much of the discussion should start revolving around that at this point.
Why don't I ask David first to respond?
Well, I mean, I think I absolutely agree that this is part of a larger sort of intellectual drive and a kind of fervid at this point, I think largely blind faith that moves forward in terms of technological development somehow mirror or even make possible moves forward in terms of the moral development. I mean, Kant always distinguishes between moral progress and what he calls physical progress. And actually, something I've realized going back to Kant and Rousseau is that the Enlightenment philosophers were far more skeptical than our current intellectuals that physical progress and moral progress went hand in hand. Far more skeptical than we tend to be now. But I would simply echo what you're saying. I think absolutely there's an unthinking, an unreckoning, an unreflective conviction that the rollout of newer and more powerful machines, more sensitive machines, more perceptive machines, are going to empower us, which gets back to David's question about liberal democracy. I think we are being told that humankind will become more powerful, but I think, as I've tried to suggest, the technology itself constitutively disempowers us. The designers of these technologies are telling us they have less power over the operation of this new technology than designers of any technology have ever had. This is what the designers are telling us, but nevertheless, I absolutely agree that it's getting sort of subsumed within a larger discourse of progress.
That provokes me to ask this question. Can machines, intelligent machines, make mistakes? And if they can, would we know it? And the reason I ask that question is because your example of the Kaczynski machine, which got sort of 4 out of 5 times the correct sexual orientation of the person, they might have got it right, actually, surely 100% of the time, except that because of upbringing or some other factor, the individual did not in fact recognize what the machine rightly saw as his or her real sexual orientation. I mean, you can imagine that somebody who has been brought up extremely strictly might, in a sense, be completely averse even to thinking about his sexuality if it seemed to be going in the wrong direction. So can machines make mistakes? And would we ever find out? And what are the implications of that?
Well, this is a very dystopian line of thinking, I must say, because indeed, perhaps the conclusion to draw is that the 20% who resist the verdict of the machine must indeed be instructed that their self-knowledge is inferior to the knowledge that the machine possesses of them. No, I mean, this question of margins of error is something, I mean, for instance, with self-driving cars, object identification, I mean, different technologies have different, quite, for the moment, well-established margins of error, demonstrable error when a human being, for instance, by a self-driving car is not recognized as a human being. And then the discussion inevitably takes place, what sort of margin of error are we willing to live with? And this, unfortunately, is not always governed by the stakes of this era in terms of human life. I think increasingly we're going to see business imperatives determining which sort of margins of error are satisfactory.
Or in the case of China and other places, political incentives.
Well, this is what I wanted to say, coming back to China, is that, again, on my reading of the technology, I would suggest that it is, let's say, intrinsically undermines, not accidentally or potentially, it intrinsically undermines the self-governance of human beings.
That's right.
And so on the personal level, and then we'll see this reflected on higher levels of social organization, but in that case, the Chinese would just be much more upfront about
Well, they have this social credit system that they're rolling out, which is the equivalent of what you get with Uber or Airbnb, that you rate things. So you're on a ranking, and you rank the ranker as well. So there's a tendency, if you have anything to do with Uber or Airbnb, is to give the guy 5 stars. So he'll give you 5 stars so that you won't get cut off. So I don't know where all that ends, but it is quite interesting, I think. The other area that's very interesting is that there is a reactionary movement within the internet connected with, against the progressive democracy that seems to be left coast in some ways. And it's connected with figures called, I don't know whether you've come across this character, Mencius Mollberg, and Nick Land, the philosopher of the Dark Enlightenment. So they're sort of contesting they're looking at a more oligarchical mode of the future, I think.
What I don't know is, and I'm very interested to hear, but I don't know how Land sees technology figuring in. Does he develop that?
I haven't read it yet,
okay.
So I'm working through that.
Well, let me throw it open to the floor again. Yes, a gentleman here, and then a lady at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Krzysztof Oczagi, and thank you for this very interesting talk. I liked this essay, and I just want to point out that you were surprised about the lack of knowledge by the commissioners and designers about our fears concerning artificial intelligence. But I also pointed out that he used the notion of good and evil throughout this essay, and I just want to ask you, are you confident that these designers have the same notion of good and evil that you have, or that the Book of Genesis has? And maybe the bigger threat is that all people who design artificial intelligence just cannot agree about this common notion of good and evil, and maybe it's not the machine intelligence that bring us evil because of them, but the lack of morality in maybe science. That's just a question.
No, I mean, thank you. I would say I'm quite confident that I myself do not share, let's say, certainly not exhaustively, perhaps fundamentally, the same sense of good and evil that some of the purveyors of the new technology, designers, do. And I'm sure they would be horrified at even the suggestion that they share the same concept of good and evil that the Book of Genesis sets out. So I'm sure we can rule that out as well. No, this is a very interesting question, but and I have no answer. I mean, in a sense, rather than questioning the motives or the agendas of those designing these technologies, some of which I was speaking in Brussels recently to the CEO of a med tech concern, which is creating intelligent technology to to read the body on a daily basis and predict months, years in advance potential health problems and so on and so forth. There's no doubt in my mind that this gentleman has the highest humanitarian motives, and of course health is an intrinsic good to which all of us desire, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that everyone's motives are identical or equally laudable to his, but I suppose I was rather concerned to say granting the highly problematic claim that they are in fact going to create intelligent machines, and granting, let's say, that their motives are unimpeachable, nevertheless, can we expect trouble? And it seems to me that we're already seeing signs that that is the case, and then I'm arguing that based on really basic philosophical questions and concerns, we could predict that we'll see trouble.
Yes, and a question at the back. I think there was one.
Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. I've been struck by this mad rush to driverless cars. And my question is, one, why? Is it strictly, money making, or is it a control issue behind it? And two, I heard a conversation where they were discussing that once this was mainstreamed, that the driver of a car would be outlawed because that would represent a random variable within this controlled system and therefore would be a safety factor. So any comments?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, first, the fact is that I haven't followed specifically the self-driving car developments very closely, so I have no, inside knowledge on the workings of the developers of those technologies. I think it's definitely touching back on the question of liberal democracy and inequality hierarchy that we discussed a moment ago. I mean, I think it's part of a larger pattern which is very, very clearly discernible, wherein we have been told for 25 years and much longer, I think, that technology will increase equality, will increase connectivity, community, solidarity, so on and so forth, when actually in many perfectly demonstrable ways it has the opposite effect. So the digital economy is increasing inequality demonstrably everywhere it takes hold. This is something that basically, to my understanding, all macro economists agree on. So in a sense, I would say it seems to be part of this larger culture in which the creators of the digital economy are simply willing at all costs to take the next step because it will be astronomically profitable for them. So getting back to the question of bad motives, I suppose I've been forced to ascribe some bad motives to some of these industrialists, tech industrialists. I think it's also, it relates back to this idea of disempowerment that I was talking about a moment ago as well. The abnegation, we're being told that this will increase our power in the world, the ease and safety and so on and so forth, but actually at every step of the way, powers which we now hold are going to be taken from us by machines which supposedly will operate more effectively. So I think psychologically it's important to see very, very clearly the kind of complex reversal which we're being sold. And you seem to see that very clearly, that we're actually stepping away from control rather than achieving new levels of control. And it's also, I mean, I try to avoid these sorts of videos as much as possible. I inadvertently saw just a clip of the recent death in Arizona caused by this self-driving car. And it's really horrible and it's horrifying. This woman who, she certainly shouldn't have been behind a self-driving wheel. Maybe she shouldn't have been behind a wheel at all. I have no idea. But the sad thing is the look of absolute horror and dismay on her face as this machine plows into an innocent person. And the fundamental, I would say, metaphysical difference between this disempowered human who realizes the gravity of what is taking place and the completely indifferent machine which drives over this person as if it's, I don't know, a traffic cone. I don't know if that really gets us anywhere, but I think it's at least worth.
Yes, absolutely. Giovanna.
Giovanna Mendato. Two questions. You've talked about a little China, Google. Can you expand upon who or what country, what industry is actually really focused on this and who's ahead of the game? And the second question is how do you control it?
Control the game, or?
Well, I think control the game because there are humans behind the game that will eventually possibly get artificial intelligence to be intelligence on its own, which is quite scary. And I just think about, for example, a very small example, your own desktop, you get new software, Microsoft 10, and you can't do anything unless you accept. It could look at your emails, it could do this, it could do that. And honestly, at that level, you're going, oh my God, they're just trying to collect so much. So who should we really be afraid of, a country, an industry, and then how can we control it?
Well,
I think so.
I have no expertise myself in this whatsoever, but I was recently at a summit in Brussels in a small room with a lot of people who do have a great deal of expertise. And the consensus there was absolutely crystal clear that China is the powerhouse. And and there are dissenting voices, but there's still, I would say, a strong consensus that both the level of investment, the absolute fearlessness in terms of political consequences, and the centralized apparatus behind it puts them at a very, very distinct advantage over Silicon Valley.
Do you have any quick comment on that?
Yeah, just one. I mean, there's obviously, in the West, there are still mechanisms where you can sort of question Facebook's use of data, as there's a current, American Senate inquiry into. In China, that doesn't occur. The major data gathering companies like Alibaba are completely working with the government in rolling out a social credit system with the effect of being able to mine algorithmic data on an ever-expanding basis. And it's the data that gives you the algorithms that makes them more perfectible, really. So China is, advancing, considerably in this area, but America still has the major knowledge at the moment. China's wake-up call was when a Google Go machine beat their Go master, comprehensively, and that was the Chinese equivalent of the Sputnik. So.
I'm going to ask, we have to break for lunch in a second. I'm going to ask one quick last question. The late Anglo-Australian philosopher Ken Minogue, known very much to you, David, and to me, wrote an essay on conditioning about 20 years ago, in which he said the thing about human beings is they can't be conditioned because they reflect upon themselves. They don't merely have consciousness, but they also have self-consciousness, and they reflect upon their own behavior, and they will eventually, if given enough incentives, break through any conditioning and change their mind, change the minds that have been set by others. I think we can see this in all kinds of ways, and we can also see that human beings, in a sense, political human beings very often set out to condition themselves. But what about machines here? I mean, we've talked about intelligence, but what about consciousness? Do we see any signs of the machines developing a sense of themselves, as, of course, the bot does in the film Her? And if they do have this, if there are any signs of this consciousness, that even more than the intelligence factor is a major cause of anxiety, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I don't know of any systems. I mean, consciousness as intelligence, as reason, these are all terms of endless debate among philosophers,
sure,
even before you begin speaking to technologists. I don't know of any claims that have been made for machine consciousness to date.
I think you know, the way in which the Google brain thinking is evolving is in a certain sense 17th century in Cartesian terms. If you know, Descartes had an automata called Francine, apparently, which was a perfectly working model. And the continuation then is the automation of reasoning. So Leibniz and the calculus and the idea that you could, and this is the Google idea that the brain is merely a set of automatic connections working a bit like Hobbes's understanding of the Leviathan, you know, kind of image at the beginning of Leviathan.
I mean, getting back to Descartes, I suppose one way to approach this is actually to argue. I mean, Descartes famously defines the res cogitans, the thinking thing, but of course we are not simply thinking things. And one way to get back to the concept of conditioning you were talking about, this kind of resistance to conditioning might have as much to do with the fact that we are more than thinking things as it has to do with consciousness as such and per se.
Yes. Well, at that fascinating midpoint, we end the discussion. I want to thank both speakers. I think it's been fascinating. I think it will continue to be fascinating, particularly since the question on the agenda when we get back will be sex with robots. Will it be better than sex with human beings? Enjoy lunch. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask for your attention? Thank you very much. I don't think it's necessary to give David Martin-Jones a second introduction. We've already heard from him in this morning's session, and of course David Dusenbury will be on hand after David Martin-Jones has spoken to respond immediately and start the discussion around the table. I think we had a very interesting session this morning. I look forward to that continuing today, this afternoon, and therefore, David, may I thank you for coming and ask you to deliver your thoughts on, well, among other things, utopia.
Thank you. Well, thanks, and that was a splendid lunch. So some of my ideas sort of coincide with David's, and others don't, which makes it interesting. My take really comes from being somewhat surprised about a year ago after I was reading about the Chinese rollout of its social credit system and what that implied in terms of data gathering, that nobody seemed to be taking the political implications of what Facebook, Google, and what some people call the GAFA techtrarchy, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Alphabet, the four main companies are doing, and you know how they're manipulating and using data. As one writer recently put it, when we outsource thinking to machines, we are outsourcing thinking to the organization that run the machines, and I suppose that's where I'm sort of coming from. And, you know, just opening the paper this morning at the hotel I was in, which gives you news in French and German and English, the French report noted that Orange, the major telecoms company, has just stopped sending telegrams. Telegrams were the great sort of internet of the 19th century. I think the American companies stopped about 10 years ago, actually, but there we are. France is a bit problematic on the labour front, I suppose, and the technology front. At the same time, we learnt that Cambridge Analytica closed down yesterday after its encounter with data and what it had revealed about its operations, which strike me as not being anything that any PR company wouldn't do, really, if they could. and that Facebook, who were really responsible for selling the data, who don't seem to have taken much of a hit, announced that not only was it still going to be mining data, it's starting its own dating service, which saw its share price jump by 1.5%. Meanwhile, again, Apple reported that it had the biggest profits ever. So this is an interesting evolution that's come remarkably rapidly. If you looked at the dates when these companies started, Facebook 2004, Gmail 2004, Twitter 2007, Airbnb about 2008, 2009, we've had this rapid revolution. And the attention of both government and people who are doing politics or thinking about the political have almost virtually ignored it. Where I used to work in Australia, when I proposed something like this for a grant, it was sort of ridiculed as something that's irrelevant. We should be doing something called post-human harm. Sorry. Yeah. So in this context and you've got the paper I've done recently for John's Quadrant in Australia, so I'm talking to that, and we'll repeat some of it, obviously. So it seems to me that part of the drive behind the new tech, the big tech, is an understanding that goes back to the Renaissance, really, and the idea of what a human being could be. The European Renaissance had both a positive side and a dark side, and particularly it gave rise to speculation about the possibility of perfection, notably amongst the Neoplatonic Academy associated in Florence with Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. And in his great oration on human dignity, Pico wrote, "What a great miracle is man, the intermediary between creatures, familiar with the gods above him as he is lord of the creatures beneath him." It was argued by some, some Renaissance scholars, that this made evil possible in the world. Man's release from a chain of being assumed God as positive at the top and evil at the bottom as merely the absence of good, an ultimate absence. When man's released to play around between the higher and the lower creatures, evil actually becomes positive in the world, and you get the precursors of the tech movements, which could be seen as the Renaissance alchemists, like Johannes Agrippa. It's in this interesting and optimistic and positive spirit of the Renaissance that later humanists like Thomas More imagined utopia, a no place, where there's never any excuse for idleness, More wrote. More's society of perfect happiness was also one of complete surveillance, which is not dissimilar to where we are today, where everyone has his eye on you. In a similar vein, and equally coming from this scientific attempt to know everything, Francis Bacon conceived a new Atlantis, where Salomon's house of the Scientific College of the 6 Days' Work would find out the true nature of all things. That scientific tendency informed the 18th century Enlightenment, which David talked about very interestingly this morning, and reinforced this quest, one could argue. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that David responded to, was also termed the modern Prometheus. It captured the boundary-freeing dream of science, which also came to address the growing irrelevance of God. By the late 19th century, both Nietzsche and Thomas Hardy had pronounced God's death. And what did that mean? As Hardy wondered, and who or what shall fill his place? Whither will wanderers turn distracted eyes for some fixed star to stimulate their pace towards the goal of their enterprise? It is in Silicon Valley that big tech offers the latest utopian answer to Hardy's question concerning the goal. And the next session is called Big Tech Meets Big Bro. In the myth of Sisyphus, the Albert Camus, the existentialist, argued that he considered the central question facing humanity in 1950s France in a post-religious and post-Holocaust world, namely, why don't we commit suicide? The big tech companies that have come over the last 2 decades to shape the new virtual world order answer the existential question with another and older one: why don't we abolish death and disease? Fictional tales of conscious machines have been science fiction themes frequently referenced by internet pioneers like Elon Musk. Apart from Blade Runner, there's I, Robot by Asimov and a brilliant film a couple of years ago called Ex Machina, which evince an obsessive desire to replicate human cognition. Silicon Valley ignores existential angst, denies biblical warnings, like my reference is not to Eden, but to Genesis 11, 1-9, the Tower of Babel, and Nimrod's attempt to conquer heaven. It offers instead what Ray Kurzweil calls the possibility of the singularity. The demise of death will represent not only the fulfillment of what he saw as the Enlightenment project, but also announce the rapture, where we become one with the machine. We're in the midst then of a technological revolution, which, like its 19th century industrial precursor, challenges our moral values, social cohesion, and identity. Smart and interactive habitats, machine learning, data mining, and domain-specific intelligence are new realities that disrupt conventional political and moral understanding and in unanticipated ways. Political and social organization has always reflected the state of technological knowledge. The invention of the stirrup created feudalism. The printing press enabled the emergence of the Gutenberg galaxy, as Marshall McLuhan put it, which gave us the Reformation and the Renaissance and the modern secular state and scientific rationalism. It liberated the free individual from the cocoon of medieval order. The start of the computer age of electronics created the global village. The computer is, Marshall McLuhan contended, the most extraordinary of all the technological clothing ever devised by man, since it is the extension of our central nervous system. New technologies create new environments. Any evaluation of the social impact of these new modes of experience must recognize that these technologies are already generations ahead of our thinking, and that's part of the problem. This technology is rolled out so fast that we haven't reflected or thought about its consequences, which are now upon us. What we might wonder, does the social media revolution and its preoccupation with big data mean for our ruling Western political and economic assumptions? More precisely, how does the latest technological clothing affect our secular, liberal, and conservative modes of experience? Pursuing the death of death is undoubtedly hubristic, but it already has transformative political and economic consequences. In practical terms, big tech has rapidly acquired immense financial, social, and technical power. Amazon, PayPal, and Google, restructured as Alphabet in 2015, launched after 1994. Gmail appeared in 2004, Uber in 2009. Significantly, it's in Silicon Valley that hosts the corporate headquarters of Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Tesla, Uber, PayPal, and Airbnb. The Valley engineers the future, and the future is algorithmic. In 2017, 8 of the world's most highly valued companies were tech businesses. In 2017, the combined market capitalization of these companies was $4.7 trillion. Each are on the way to being trillion-dollar companies. That is 30% of the combined capitalization of the other 92 companies in the world's 100 most valuable firms. It is no accident that the Silicon Valley experiment evolved in California and reflects the progressive libertarian idealism of the 1960s. Steve Jobs, the founding father, was a hippie dropout. An anti-establishment worldview shaped the Valley's techtopia as it proceeded, as one book called called it From Counterculture to Cyberculture. At the same time, infant tech startups like Apple from the 1980s onwards benefited from the private sector reforms, monetarist free market, and minimal state thinking that underpinned both Thatcherism and, of course, Reaganomics. This libertarian understanding formed the side constraints that nurtured the cyberculture takeoff. In other words, libertarian in its foundations, the creators of the virtual world conceive it as an anarchy along hippie communalist lines. The Internet Rights Charter holds the Internet to be a global public space, open, affordable, accessible to all. Like the major US, but not the Chinese big tech companies, the Charter upholds freedom of expression and rights to privacy, in theory. However, despite its libertarian origins, current big tech behavior disavows its free market competitive roots. The economic strategy of the new media leviathans is not competition, but what Thiel and others, Larry Page at Google, have called creative monopoly. The difference between Apple's current book-to-share market value assumes the supernormal profits that only a monopoly could deliver. Under monopolist conditions, the GAFA tetrarchy impact on print and mainstream media has been both transformative and destabilizing. Facebook, Google, and Twitter are media platforms that mine data and generate profit through advertising. In 2017, Google and Facebook received 63% of all US digital advertising revenue. However, these enormously profitable businesses are parasitic on the investment in collecting information made by others. Despite weaponizing the First Amendment, Twitter, Facebook, and Google have become highly efficient disseminators of non-information. Paradoxically, the new space of virtual freedom is the most valuable weapon for political control, used by people of ill will, from Putin's fancy bears to Islamic State. They afford platforms for the deliberate dissemination of dangerous falsehoods. These developments raise huge issues for maintaining an open society from online enemies that neither Karl Popper or the theorist of anarchy, the state, and utopia in the 1970s, Robert Nozick, could envisage. One consequence that is very important from a free market perspective is the evolution of an intangible economy. In Capitalism Without Capital, Jonathan Haskell and Stian Westlake examine how major developed economies now invest in intangible assets, design, branding, R&D, and software, rather than intangible assets such as physical machinery or buildings. They contend that these intangibles have determined the key economic changes of the last decade, from economic inequality to stagnating productivity. The intangible economy differs fundamentally from the tangible one. New technology drives this change, integrating software and design into a brand that creates value. Its characteristics involve scalability of the product design, especially through the new global communications environment, spillovers into other products, which they can then take over in the same domain, and synergies where design and development hubs create dynamic environments where they cluster, revitalizing areas like Shoreditch in London, whilst at the same time generating great disparities in wealth and its distribution across the wider society. While intangibility flourishes, the old economy, wages, and employment stagnate. Yet investment in intangibles, the major source of investment in the UK, US, and Sweden, and a growing one in Hungary, is risky because products are both scalable and mobile. They can move, and they move to where tax is cheapest, or they don't pay tax at all, which is the model for both Google and Amazon. It is estimated that in 10 years there will be 150 billion network measuring sensors. This will produce a massive data about personal preferences, which will enable those who own it to disconnect the means of doing politics from its ends. The new media platforms increasingly gather data to produce information that influences decision-making, disrupting the political relationship between the individual, the rule of law, and the market. Social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google already offer platforms to target voter preferences and facilitate extremist ideologies that render democratic processes open to divisive manipulation by alien powers. Putin's subversive propaganda campaigns have been so successful because, as one commentator observed, all he needed was social media. Current discussions concerning social media focuses primarily on its effects on the economic and social infrastructure, the job market, personal privacy, or democratic transparency, and the manipulation of the electorate through fake news and disinformation. However, merely addressing AI's external impact on society neglects the existential question, which comes back to David's really, how will intelligent algorithms affect the liberal self-understanding of the autonomous rational self? And second section really is with this. Conceptions of social contract, natural right, and liberty that shape from the early modern period secular political understanding assumes a rational individual. Despite developments in neuroscience that currently dispute the understanding of the self as a single essence, these do not by themselves have moral or political implications. Even if my internal voice is not as free as I once thought it was, no one knows better than I what I want most. Science notwithstanding, I still have every reason to value and protect my free choices. Artificial intelligence and data mining, however, alters this paradigm. AI will soon be able to analyze individuals in such intimate detail that it will know them better than they know themselves. This has implications, evidently, for the self-owning autonomous individual, central to liberal democratic theory and practice. Governments will increasingly use algorithms to predict policy outcomes. Once a ruling elite accepts that the intelligent machine holds the right answer and their electorates enjoy the benefits of its success, we will, as if by an invisible hand, enter a condition of techno-tutelage. AI could attain a level of intelligence vastly greater than humanity's combined intellectual wherewithal, rendering the psychological and political utility of voting redundant. AI will not be a tool to make our lives easier. It will construct intelligent systems capable of participating in a feedback loop with humans. AI will present us with answers about our nature, needs, and desires that we did not know we wanted. It will force us to question what it means to exist with dignity and what value should be preserved in order to live the good life, the central question of philosophy, really. AI thus challenges the values that shape our social and political order and renders abstract philosophical arguments in defense of individual freedom potentially irrelevant. So AI meets Homo Deus. For Silicon Valley, I call Silicon Valley Siliconians because it sounds like utopian, or I could call them techtopians. For techtopians, AI dataism assumes a quasi-religious status. Ray Kurzweil, the chief of engineering at Google, a media platform now mutating into an AI business, as we heard this morning, predicted in 2006 in his key work, The Age of Spiritual Machines. He argued that the human species, together with the computational age technology it created, will be able to solve age-old problems in a post-biological future. That's a quote. From Kurzweil's transhumanist perspective, we have entered the fifth evolutionary epoch, where human intelligence merges with technology to reach what he calls the singularity, which is a space tech term, at which point we, or at least an elite, would be transformed into spiritual machines. Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom argues that it's probable that we already inhabit a matrix-like simulation created by our post-human descendants This is based on Kurzweil's law of accelerating returns. Socrates maintained that to philosophize is to learn how to die. Whether the soul is eternal, or perishes with the body, Western civilization historically recognized this natural order of things. Big tech transhumanism, by contrast, seeks life everlasting. Bostrom's followers embrace simulation theology. They include big tech pioneers like Google, as well as Peter Thiel at Palantir and PayPal, and Elon Musk of SpaceX and Tesla, which have founded the Singularity University and the Future of Humanity Institute. Beyond criticizing what he calls, quote, the ideology of the inevitability of the death of every individual, Thiel also finances SENS, strategically engineered negligible senescence research foundation devoted to, quote, curing death. The Zuckerbergs, Tim Cooks, and Larry Pages called the shots on America's left coast. Although they maintain similar professional profiles as investors and entrepreneurs, Thiel's endorsement of Trump stands out against big tech's overwhelming progressive sympathies for doing, quote, the right thing, Google, and building global community, quote, Zuckerberg. Yet what unifies Zuckerberg, Kurzweil, Musk, and Thiel may be more decisive than the traditional Republican-Democrat political divide. All techtopians embrace an ideology of technologism, or more accurately, an abstract scientific rationalism that overrides conventional left-right partisanship. All questions recede before the task of technological progress. Incessant invention is what they're about. As Elon Musk, channeling Francis Bacon, explained in a Rolling Stone interview last year, big tech applies scientific method both to engineering and society. It's really helpful, he maintains, for figuring out the tricky things. Techtopians possess an unprecedented belief in building new worlds by promulgating a technological ideal untrammeled by the threat of competition or social discontent. Visionary entrepreneurs like Musk, Thiel, or Zuckerberg have in the process assumed the status of philosopher CEOs. Unlike the classical world, where philosophy was a stoic and contemplative affair, the new philosopher CEO augments his wealth and scale in the service of realizing a utopia, a global community, based on incessant innovation. Zuckerberg, Page, Thiel, and Musk pursue, like Bacon before them, the vision of a new Atlantis. More precisely, the technological techtopian vision represents the latest version of what the English political philosopher Michael Oakeshott identified as the modern problem in politics, rationalism. This style first emerged in the 16th century with people like Bacon. It emphasized reason not as Aristotle or Aquinas understood it, namely as a faculty of the practical understanding, but as Bacon and subsequently Descartes and Kant came to view it in rationalist, theoretical, or abstract scientific terms. The possibility of certain knowledge, which a scientific method applied to the realm of politics or society intimates, provides a technique which not only ends with certainty, but begins with certainty and is certain throughout. Already by the early decades of the 20th century, the extent to which particular traditions and cultures had given way to the pan-rational ideologies of Marxism, liberalism, and nationalism illustrated how deeply the rationalist disposition had invaded modern political thought and practice. In the case of the Silicon Valley, the new ideology is data. As Ray Kurzweil observed, AI merely confirms the rationalism of the Enlightenment project. This rationalist concern with technique always intimates a politics of perfection. It requires, it's not only about a politics of perfection, it's also about a politics of conformity. And monopoly and conformity tend to go together. In its 20th century ideological form, it welcomed the growing bureaucratic power of government to make its politics of faith conform to the rational plan. Oakeshott, as a conservative, contrasted the experience of a particular contingent condition with the rationalist endeavor from the 17th and 18th century onwards to reduce the tangle and variety of experience to a set of universal principles. Cutting itself off from the traditional knowledge of society, rationalism, or what Musk terms the scientific method, combines the politics of perfection with the politics of uniformity. Political activity consequently consists in bringing the social, political, legal, and institutional inheritance of society before the tribunal of the rationalists or the technologists' intellect. The rest, as those who experience the rollout of the intelligence-gathering Chinese social credit system, is but rational administration. So what will be done? The new giants of tech, Silicon Valley's biggest companies, don't crave monopoly merely for profit, unfortunately. Instead, big tech considers the concentration of power in its companies, in the networks they control, an urgent social good, the precursor to global harmony, hence the old hippie tendency, a necessary condition for undoing the alienation of humankind. Under such conditions of internet oligopoly, techno-managerialism, through the manipulation of choices, fears, and desires, replaces the autonomous individual of liberal thought with a servile dependency. The emergence of big tech renders democracy potentially obsolete and creates conditions for elite rule based on the control and access to technology and big data. This is already happening in China, where the ruling party, in collaboration with big data companies like Alibaba and a universal social credit system, is constructing a digital dystopia. Somewhat differently, across the splinter net, we can identify in Silicon Valley utopianism the lineaments of a new techno-guardian class, building transnational networks and an evolving theory of political and social organization framed by around Wilfredo Pareto's 20-80 rule, the Pareto principle, and Gaetano Mosca's theory of elite circulation, both critics of democracy at the end of the 19th century. The recent eruption of populism, signified by Trump, Brexit, and the victories of PIS in Poland and Orban's Fidesz in Hungary, might only be a temporary blip, susceptible ultimately to long-term data management and big nudging. Silicon Valley's craving for monopoly stretches back to the counterculture of the 1960s, where it emerged from the most lyrical visions of peace and love. The hippie counterculture of Haight-Ashbury dreamt from the outset of subverting the straight, conservative traditional order. Such utopian visions, grounded in anarchic idealism, are of course the problem, not the solution, if you're a conservative. They present the antithesis to the conservative understanding of civil society as a local and contingent compact between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. As the English conservative philosopher Roger Scruton notes of the current great disruption, the tech world of virtual networks erodes places and erases the hierarchies that settle there. They replace space by time and time by a succession of crowded instants in which nothing really happens, since everything only happens on screen. The web is an unspecified nowhere, a utopia, a Hobbesian state of nature in cyberspace. But for that reason, it cannot compete with the trustworthy somewhere for which most people yearn. It is a release from place, but not a replacement. For the techtopian entrepreneur, to engage in this rationalist quest is a gamble, which may or may not have its insubstantial rewards. However, one undertaken in a society not itself engaged in the gamble, it is mere folly. The project of finding a shortcut to heaven, returning to Genesis, is as old as the human race, and conduct that orients self by big data, the scientific method, and its axiomatic rules, attempts this kind of shortcut. Such projects assume that they may avoid the difficulties of life by engaging in a scheme in which the ends have been determined for them. They explicitly pursue a future state of perfection, all the while neglecting the joys and sorrows of our present temporality. Significantly, the media technologies we have used have rapidly turned into compulsions. This is just as their designers intended. The rationalist technique has not entirely escaped those involved at the birth of big tech. Facebook's first president, Sean Parker, acknowledges it was designed to act like a drug by giving you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. The social media companies deliberately exploit vulnerabilities in human psychology. As well as addicting its users, social media contributes to continuous partial attention, limiting a people's ability to focus. Everyone is distracted all of the time. As well as becoming stupid and inattentive, big tech undermines political democracy with the tyranny of big data, altering voters' beliefs and behavior by intentionally and precisely targeting their unconscious cognitive processes. This is the basis of the Cambridge Analytica psychometric profile called OCEAN, which divides people into categories based on openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And with its mass data acquired from Facebook, can divide the population up accordingly and direct and target messages, particularly in crucial, say, swing constituencies, in ways that will affect the outcome. However, it may not all be bad news. Some observers wonder whether the social media era may have peaked. The current attention, Cambridge Analytica is closed. Facebook might be in trouble if the Senate committee does anything, which it should. Somewhat belatedly, Western governments have started to pursue the tech monopolists under antitrust laws, which were always there, as well as render them accountable for the material they post. The Senate Joint Committee hearing into Facebook's social media privacy and the use and abuses of data may lead to the media platform's breakup, but maybe not. The truth is that a rationalist project in this form breeds nothing but distraction and moral and political instability. Former Facebook executive Chamath Palihapitiya, like Sean Parker, now feels guilty about the socio-political implications of technological manipulation. Musk wants to colonize Mars before robot wars destroy Earth. Chagrin ultimately awaits all those who embark upon such utopian enterprises. Here finishes the lesson.
David, thank you very much. Well, very powerful, if I may use the word Jeremiah, with a not totally convincing feel-good ending. But may I ask David Dusenbury to begin the discussion?
Well, there's so much to come back on. I mean, if I could begin with an extremely pedantic point, which is the easiest place to start. One of the only, John mentioned that my doctoral thesis was on a little-known character, Nemesius of Emesa, and one of his only claims to fame, which no one knows, so it's not really fame of any sort, is that he was more or less cribbed by Pico in his hymn to the dignity of humankind. So I want to excuse Pico for the decline into hell that follows, since he was using my guy. I'm curious. I was very interested in the next point you made with Utopia and New Atlantis. this kind of gets back to the question we discussed in the last hour about the cult of progress and acceleration that you talk a great deal about. But it seems to me that one of the curious things, certainly about the New Atlantis, is that Bacon puts forward this radical vision of, scientific culture. But his political philosophy is based on stability and even stasis. And I'm curious how you think this link might have been broken, that suddenly social philosophy, let's say, and technological or scientific inquiry become linked in this kind of accelerationist project.
Do you want to come back, David?
I thought that's a very good point. I think, I tend to follow Oakeshott here. So Bacon's the one who tends to make this claim for scientific knowledge. And as you rightly say, he's quite a conservative political figure and a skeptic about political possibility. I think as we move forward with the scientific revolution of the 18th century and the shift towards the understanding that you could now use science in politics in a way that Bacon hadn't perhaps conceived, that the movement accelerates in that direction. So that by the time you get to the age of ideology in the 20th century, you get the idea that science now can, was it Joseph Skoretsky, engineer human souls. It can make new men, which was always the socialist program, or the new Chinese man based on the poor and the blank in Mao's understanding. So science, the evolution of science or the development of science and the scientific method along lines, presaged by Bacon, took on a new dimension from the 18th and 19th century onwards would be how I'd see that.
Do you want to come back before?
We can open it up. And all.
Let's open it up. Who would like to come in and raise the next question? Now, I know you've had a good lunch, but that's not an excuse. Yes, Melissa.
It's Melissa from the Danube Institute. Would you like to comment upon the nudge theory and how this interacts with big data?
Both explain and comment on the nudge theory.
The nudge, big nudging, was early 2000s. It was a work by Cass Sunstein, I think, at MIT, and someone else, but she got the big rep for it. And it's the idea, it's the basis of how you, look at certain, say, constituencies that might turn Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, or Labour, Conservative, whatever, and you look at certain issues, and you nudge people on those issues by targeting the vote. Algorithms can feed into that, as the Cambridge Analytica model, demonstrates. The classic example, the way it evolves is out of behaviorist psychology in terms of supermarkets. Like when you go to a supermarket, you got all the stuff you want, but you're in a queue waiting for the checkout to take your money, and there's always lined up along that area sweet bars, Cokes, chewing gum, chocolates, and you'll nudge to take them because you're bored, you're in the queue. Big nudging works like that. It uses material in your in a specific area to nudge you along lines that you already have a sort of predilection for and make you go that way. So you might not be thinking of voting for Trump, but you will because you've been nudged in that direction. Google conducted huge nudging during Obama's election. So it's used on both sides, but it does mean that if you're being nudged, are you really choosing what you want to choose?
Doesn't that come up against the point that the end of the last session we raised, which is that human beings reflect upon themselves and consequently can't, in a sense, be conditioned. And conditioning is presumably a more thorough version of nudging. And I'm thinking of a remark of two Anglo-American political theorists whom we both knew, actually, William and Shirley Letwin, who said about the individual and the individual's identity that the human being is both potter and potter's clay, for he or she inevitably decides what to make of whatever happens to them.
Well, you know, I hope they're right. I think, you know, I would absolutely share that view. But what we can see by this data mining, data gathering, and the way that people can be targeted and affected would seem to indicate that this understanding, you know, this kind of practice of manipulation will continue and it will, you know, evolve, I think. It goes back to the basis of PR, I think, in, you know, particularly the 1950s. You know, I don't know, do you remember The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard?
Yes.
There was always this interest in, you know, some people are reflective. It goes back really to Machiavelli, I think, because Machiavelli, who was a Republican but very cynical, obviously, about the human condition, divided people into the ferbo and the fesso, the cunning and the stupid. And I suppose the basis of big data gathering and manipulation is that certain people will be reflexive, but you can always rely on the majority being stupid. And if you can get the stupids to vote, then, you know, you've got chances.
David, does manipulation go back to the Garden of Eden?
Well, this is a question for the theologians, I'm afraid. The role of the serpent is something that I'm entirely unqualified to address. But since we've mentioned theologians, I'm kind of curious whether, I mean, the image you mentioned simulation theology. And I'm a bit curious, kind of a follow-up to the question I asked, is how you argue very persuasively that these technological developments erode the basis of the liberal self-understanding. But I'm also curious whether the liberal self-understanding might not, in certain regards, contribute to the emergence of this technology. And then if so, my question then becomes, because of course the liberal self-understanding is among many other things, based on the sort of official exclusion of metaphysics from the public sphere. And I'm wondering whether, in a sense, the only way to push back against this sort of technologism is a form of metaphysical resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you know, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I think we're still suffering from the death of God, really.
As you were coming to the end of your remarks, David, the name James Burnham popped into my head because you were quoting two of the elite theorists who are the basis of a lot of his thought. And obviously it does seem to me that the picture you're painting is a picture of the managerial revolution squared. But in his most important book, I think, The Machiavellians, third name, he argues that democracy is a system in which you get to the public doesn't decide things, but it does get to choose between two rival sets of explainers. Now, my question would be, does democracy mean that we will have rival explainers, which gives us a kind of our choice? We know what each side is doing, or are these people all on the same side?
Well, that's yeah. Well, I think that's the big question, because at the moment, a lot of them are on the side of the global community vision. You know, I mean, the only standouts are people like Thiel, but what they share in common is the commitment to technologism. Now, I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but the worry is, as we heard this morning, was that a lot of it is on the side of, you know, so-called progressive, democratic universalism and global humanity. But then at the same time, you've also got China that doesn't believe in that vision. And it has I was talking to someone recently who said that there's a Chinese put-down word for a Western liberal humanitarian globalist called Zobo or something, which is, a term of abuse, really. So, I'm not sure. What clearly we're beginning to live with, if there is this sort of the tendency in the West towards an elite democratic progressivism, in which, if you were taking the Machiavellian route of the progressivist, you'd say that Trump or Brexit was a blip. We better get our data management right next time around to make sure that the groups that have used it perversely don't triumph again, which is, the way I think the Zuckerbergs will be thinking. That he's not ruled out a potential political presence at some point. On the other hand, the Chinese world will evolve very differently. So we're living with what some people have called the splinter net now, where the world breaks down into two, because Facebook and Google can't operate in China, which is quite, Trump's trying to do something about that, quite rightly, I think. But at the moment, there is this sort of bifurcation, if you like, in the internet world.
Can I take what will have to be the last question or two questions? Yes, the gentleman here. Sorry, lady. I'm sorry, I couldn't see you. I just saw a hand.
Amy Motley, and you paint a very, for me, unsettling picture of the future. And to make it very succinct, what is, in your vision, all three gentlemen up there, of the worst case scenario that can happen?
David Dusenbury to start, and then come back to
you. Some sort of nuclear holocaust brought on by non-human actors would be, let's say, the worst case scenario in the near future. Because even nuclear weapons are presently existing technology, so it's very hard to sort of talk about worst case scenarios in terms of technologies which have yet to emerge. But it does seem that there's been talk in foreign policy circles of the possibility of non-human actors sort of creating,
I will answer before David does, and I would say, in a way, the worst, but also perhaps in view of your response, David, the best case outcome is a brave new world, a successful brave new world in which the manipulated are successfully manipulated. And those of you who read the Huxley book, people like us, one person like us, suddenly lands in this future, and at first it seems to be a wonderful utopia, which gradually, of course, he comes to feel, well, he commits suicide at the end, really, comes to feel that it is an inhuman place in which there could be neither real sorrow, real joy, real love, real commitment, and he finds this unbearable. So that, I think, is possibly the worst outcome. It is, of course, a world in which, there's not much discussion about voting and choices in elections and whether or not people are conservative or liberal.
Yeah, they had a drug, didn't they? Soma. Yeah. Well, I think there's something along John's lines is probably not inaccurate, actually. It seems to me that, the looking at the those elite democratic theorists of the late 19th century who were quite smart on these things, I think, is that the manipulation that could occur and the need for political parties that mobilize votes through algorithmic methods leads to, what Robert Michels called the iron law of oligarchy. But I take also David's point that, the potential for a catastrophic event given the technologies and the worrying fact that those who've created those algorithms don't know how they're going to operate is tremendously disturbing. Apparently, all the tech companies are waiting. They've got a term for it, the big one. The big one is coming. It's the equivalent of a financial crash, but on, technologist levels that we cannot currently contemplate. When you think of, how communication systems are run, data that we have, health records, the way, modern cities are run, through computer mechanized controls. If all that was crashed by an alien power or some fault within the machine, the consequences could be, unquantifiable, perhaps.
May I ask, Melissa, how long we've got?
Well, I think it's probably time, unless there's any more discussion, that we move downstairs back out to the garden and let the conversation continue there.
In that case, what I'm going to say is, unless there's somebody who has a desperately important question to put. No, in that case, let me just ask for final remarks from both Davids, and then we'll go downstairs.
Well, I haven't prepared any final remarks. I suppose, rather than ending on the note of the worst possible scenario, as I have begun to think about the issues raised by these new technologies, I'm very fond of a line of Bertolt Brecht, life on this earth is dangerous. And, danger takes new and remarkable and, in this case, baffling forms, but nevertheless, there is nothing new whatsoever about danger. And it seems that the new technologies give us cause for great concern, but nevertheless prompt us to revisit which I try to do in a modest way, very old fundamental questions regarding what it is to be human, what it is to be responsible, what it is to strive for a dignified and a just order.
Well, that was put very nicely, David. I think, likewise, I think what becomes very evident from what we've discussed today is still something that has haunted humanity from the outset. And it's perhaps time to go back to some of the classics of political and philosophical thought, because the idea of, the myth of Prometheus and the myth of Nimrod are things that we should keep constantly in mind and perhaps teach more in our schools and elsewhere.
Well, I think I'm going to sum up as follows, before I invite you to express your gratitude for the speakers. We seem to have been left with a choice in which the ambitious attempt to solve human problems by taking the passions out of them and making them purely realistic or data-driven, which is what lies is the secret of Brave New World, and which is hard to achieve because, of course, it ignores the fact that the planners who are taking passion out of all these questions don't have passions of their own, when we all know they have actually, in many respects, stronger passions. Suppose, however, that does succeed, it seems to me we've been left with the terrible possibility that having drained human life of destructive passion, we will have invented machines that have passions of their own, which we cannot predict and which may prove fatal to us. So, this provides us with excellent topics for the next conference of this kind, which will certainly take place and to which you will all be welcome. And having said that, I want to thank the two Davids for a terrifically exciting 2 speeches and making themselves available to comment on your responses. I want to congratulate you as well. You might have asked more questions, but the questions you asked were wonderful. So maybe we can continue to ask questions downstairs over a coffee. In the meantime, David, thank you very much indeed.